67,000 people stood in a field in Portugal in 1917 and watched the sun spin. 107 years later, a new pope knelt on a cobblestone in Rome and pressed his hand to a spot of marble. 45 years had passed since a bullet crossed that exact point in space. What connected those two moments, a spinning sun over Fatima and a kneeling pope in St. Peter's Square, was a secret. Not a rumor, not a conspiracy. A document sealed, opened, read in silence. And now, for the first time in his pontificate, Pope Leo XIV has answered the question that Catholics around the world have been quietly asking since the day he was elected. What does he actually believe about Fatima? What did he say when confronted with the vision? And why, on a Wednesday morning in May, did he stop the entire processional route of his general audience, walk to a single stone in the piazza, and kneel? That is where this begins. To understand what Pope Leo XIV did on the 13th of May 2026, one must go back further than his pontificate. One must go back to a hillside in central Portugal, to 3 shepherd children, and to a series of appearances that the Catholic Church has never fully finished processing. Not in 1917 when they began, not in 2000 when the last sealed document was opened, and not now in the middle of a pontificate that has already surprised everyone who thought they could predict it. Fatima is a small town. It sits in a valley between Lisbon and Coimbra, surrounded by the kind of landscape that is both unremarkable and quietly beautiful. Rolling hills, dry stone walls, flocks of sheep that still move through fields at dusk. In May of 1917, 3 children were tending their flock on a property called the Cova da Iria when they reported seeing a woman clothed in light standing above a small holm oak tree. Her name, she would eventually tell them, was Our Lady of the Rosary. She asked them to return on the 13th of every month for 6 months. She told them the world was in danger. She told them that prayer, most specifically the Rosary, could change the course of history. And she gave them 3 secrets. The first 2 secrets were revealed relatively quickly. The first was a vision of hell, of souls falling into fire like burning embers, a sight so terrible that the eldest child, Lucia dos Santos, later wrote that she would have died of fear had Our Lady not promised them a path through it. The second secret was a prophecy and a request. If people did not stop offending God, a worse war would begin than the one then consuming Europe. Russia would spread its errors throughout the world, and the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, would suffer greatly. The third secret was different. Lucia wrote it down in January of 1944, sealed it in an envelope, and gave it to the Bishop of Leiria with the instruction that it was to be opened no earlier than 1960, when she believed it would be better understood. It passed through the hands of Pope John XXIII, who read it in 1960 and chose not to reveal it. It passed to Paul VI, who read it and passed it on. It sat in the papal apartments, a small folded document in Portuguese, while the world watched the Cold War deepen and the Church itself entered the turbulence of the post-conciliar years. And then something happened that changed everything. On the 13th of May 1981, Pope John Paul II was crossing St. Peter's Square in his open vehicle, moving through an enormous crowd when a gunman raised a pistol and fired. The bullet struck the Pope in the abdomen. He lost consciousness. He came within minutes of dying. When he recovered, and his recovery, his physicians would say, should not have been medically possible, he asked for the third secret of Fatima. He read it in the hospital, and in his own words, he became convinced that Our Lady had guided the bullet away from his heart. The date was May 13th, the anniversary of the first apparition. John Paul returned to Fatima 3 times after that. He carried the bullet with him, the bullet that had been meant to kill him, and placed it in the crown of Our Lady's statue at the shrine. In the year 2000, during the beatification of Francisco and Jacinta, the 2 youngest seers, he authorized the full release of the third secret. Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, then head of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith and the future Pope Benedict XVI, presented it to the world with a lengthy theological commentary. The vision itself is arresting in its imagery. A bishop dressed in white walks through a ruined city, climbing toward the summit of a steep mountain on which stands a rough-hewn cross. Around him, other bishops and priests and lay faithful fall one by one, struck by the weapons of soldiers. The bishop in white reaches the cross and is killed there. Lucia, in the vision, heard an angel cry out a single word 3 times. Penance, penance, penance. The Church's official interpretation, presented by Ratzinger in that year 2000 commentary, was that the vision referred to the 20th century's persecution of Christians, and specifically to the assassination attempt against John Paul II. The suffering was real. The bishop in white who falls and rises, that interpretation concluded, was John Paul, saved by Our Lady's intercession on a May afternoon in Rome. But the questions never entirely went away. There were Catholics and theologians and careful observers of the Church who noted that the vision seemed to encompass something larger than one event, however dramatic. There were those who pointed to Lucia's own statements over the decades, statements that seemed to suggest the full weight of the secret had not yet been exhausted by any single moment in history. There were those who observed that a document promising peace for Russia, delivered in 1917, carried an urgency that felt different in the 2020s, with Europe once again at war than it had in the relative quiet of the Jubilee year 2000. And there were those who watched very carefully to see what the new Pope would say. Robert Francis Prevost was elected on the 8th of May 2025, taking the name Leo XIV. He was the first American-born pope in history, a fact that generated enormous attention and considerable noise. But those who looked past the biographical novelty found something more interesting. A man formed by the Augustinian tradition, shaped by years of missionary work in Peru, deeply rooted in a theology of grace and conversion, and possessed of a studied, deliberate quality in his public statements. He did not speak carelessly. He did not generate drama for its own sake. When he said something significant, it was because he meant it to be significant. Almost immediately after his election, Pope Leo XIV expressed his desire to visit Fatima. The remark was noted and then filed away by the Catholic press, logged as one item among many on a future travel itinerary still being assembled. But those who understood the language of papal gestures understood that the desire to visit Fatima was not casual. No pope visits Fatima casually. The shrine is too charged, too layered with meaning, too bound up with the deepest questions the Church asks about history and suffering and the nature of God's action in the world. Then came May 13th, 2026. The Feast of Our Lady of Fatima falls on the 13th of May because that was the date of the first apparition in 1917. In the Catholic liturgical calendar, it is a memorial, not a solemnity, not a feast of the highest rank, but a day set apart to remember an event that the Church has designated as worthy of belief. It also happened in 2026 to fall on a Wednesday, and Wednesday, for the Pope, means the general audience in St. Peter's Square. Crowds had gathered early that morning. The spring air in Rome in mid-May carries a particular quality, warm but not yet heavy. The light arriving at an angle that makes the stone of the basilica appear almost golden. Tens of thousands of pilgrims had assembled in the piazza, many of them wearing blue, the color associated with Mary, many of them holding rosaries. The audience hall had not contained them all. They spilled out into the square itself. What happened before the formal audience began was not announced. It was not on the schedule. It was, in that sense, a spontaneous act, or at least an act that Leo XIV had chosen not to explain in advance, allowing it to speak entirely for itself. As the Pope made his way through the crowd in the Pope-mobile, he stopped. The vehicle came to a halt at a particular spot near the center of the piazza. Those close enough to see what was happening grew quiet. Pope Leo XIV stepped down. He walked a few steps to a marble plaque set into the piazza's cobblestones. The plaque bore the coat of arms of John Paul II and the date May 13, 1981. It marked the exact spot where the assassination attempt had taken place 45 years earlier. Leo knelt. He remained still for a moment, then he reached down and placed his hand flat against the marble. What he was doing was visible to everyone who could see him. What he was thinking was known only to him. But those who have studied the language of papal action, the weight of gesture in a tradition that has always understood that the body speaks as clearly as the voice, understood that this was not a casual moment of remembrance. This was a man who had thought carefully about what Fatima means, who had absorbed the full arc of the story, who understood that the spot beneath his hand was not merely a historical footnote, but a node in a network of meaning that ran from a hillside in Portugal in 1917 to a piazza in Rome in 1981 to this morning in the May sunlight. He rose. He returned to the vehicle. The audience continued. And then he spoke. The catechesis that Leo XIV delivered that morning was drawn from the final chapter of Lumen Gentium, the Second Vatican Council's dogmatic constitution on the Church. In its closing pages, the Council had turned to Mary, to her role not as a figure above or outside the Church, but as its model, its most perfect member, and its mother. Leo took this framework and built his entire reflection around it, moving through three dimensions of Mary's relationship to the community of believers. She is the model of what the Church is called to be. This is where he began. Citing the Council's own words, he described how Mary received the Word of God with faith and virginal love, and in doing so became an image of the entire community that is called to receive Christ in the same way. In the Mother of the Lord, the Pope said, the Church contemplates her own mystery, not a statue, not an icon from a distance, a mystery that the Church looks at and recognizes as its own reflection. She is the preeminent member of the community of believers. This is where Leo moved next, and the move was quietly significant. In Catholic theology, there has always been a tension between approaches that emphasize Mary's exceptionality, her unique role, her singular privileges, and approaches that situate her within the community of those saved by Christ. Leo chose the integrating language. Mary as believer par excellence. She who was unconditionally open to the divine mystery. She who is not honored in place of the faithful, but honored as the first among them. She is the mother of the whole Church. And here, in the third movement of his catechesis, Leo XIV arrived at the emotional and theological center of his reflection. Not just the mother of Jesus, not just the mother of the church in some abstract institutional sense. The mother to whom every individual believer can turn with filial confidence in the certainty of being heard, protected, and loved. This is the language of relationship, of access, of a door that does not close. He did not deliver a formal address on Fatima itself. He did not revisit the question of the third secret. He did not speak about the assassination attempt against John Paul, or about Russia, or about the specific requests Our Lady had made in 1917. What he did instead was something more fundamental. He established, in precise theological language, why Fatima matters at all. Because if Mary is what Lumen Gentium says she is, model member mother, then her appearances in history are not curiosities or private revelations to be examined and filed away. They are invitations addressed to the whole church, pressing and urgent and not yet exhausted. And then came the words that would be shared across the Catholic world in the hours that followed. Speaking in Portuguese to the pilgrims who had come from that language and culture, Leo XIV turned directly toward them and delivered a sentence that carried the full weight of Fatima's own message, unchanged from its source. He said, "In this Marian month, I would like to reiterate the invitation of the Virgin of Fatima. Pray the rosary every day for peace." And then, in a second statement whose brevity made it more rather than less powerful, "Together with Mary, we ask that men not close themselves to this gift of God, and that they disarm their hearts." Disarm their hearts. Those three words landed differently in different places. For the pilgrims in the square, they were a call to personal conversion, to the interior work of setting down anger and fear and hardness. For those watching the wider world, and it would have been impossible not to watch the wider world in the spring of 2026, they carried another register entirely. Europe was not at peace. The global tensions that had characterized the early years of the decade had not eased. The word disarm was not abstract. And here was the Pope of Rome on the feast of Our Lady of Fatima, borrowing her own language and redirecting it at the present moment. He then turned to the Arabic-speaking Christians in the crowd. To them, he said that the rosary was once an effective means of obtaining true peace in our hearts. He asked for blessings upon them. He asked God to protect them from all evil. The audience closed. The crowds dispersed slowly into the Roman afternoon. The marble plaque where Leo XIV had knelt remained, as it always had, set into the cobblestones of the piazza. The red-painted stone that had marked the spot for decades had only recently been replaced by that carved marble. Another change, another small act of remembrance and restoration. But the question that had been alive in Catholic circles for months, what does Leo XIV actually think about Fatima, had received its answer. Not in the form of a document or a declaration or a theological treatise, in the form of a gesture and a sentence and a choice about where to stop a vehicle on a May morning. And here's where things become even more significant. Because what Leo XIV did on May 13th, 2026, was not only a response to the past, it was, for those paying attention, a signal about the future. He had said, since the early months of his pontificate, that he wanted to go to Fatima. That desire had been noted and filed and regarded by some as polite aspiration, the kind of thing a new pope says before the weight of the calendar becomes clear. But the gesture in the piazza and the words in the catechesis had a different quality. They were the words and gestures of someone who has been thinking carefully, who is building toward something, who understands that the story of Fatima is not finished. The shrine at Fatima receives millions of visitors each year. It is one of the most significant pilgrimage destinations in the Catholic world. The great esplanade in front of the Basilica of Our Lady of the Rosary stretches longer than the nave of St. Peter's itself. On major feast days, the crowd that gathers there is vast and various. Portuguese families who come every year without exception, pilgrims from Brazil and Angola and Mozambique and the Philippines and Poland, the sick and the healthy and the doubtful and the convinced. When a pope arrives at Fatima, the weight of the occasion is impossible to overstate. It has happened only a small number of times in the modern era. Paul VI in 1967, the 50th anniversary, John Paul II in 1982, 1991, and 2000, Benedict XVI in 2010, Francis in 2017, the centenary. Each visit has carried its own specific message. Paul VI came at a moment of post-conciliar turbulence and prayed for peace, his visit coinciding with the final phases of the Vietnam War. John Paul II came in Thanksgiving, carrying the bullet that had not killed him, making of the shrine a place of personal and communal gratitude. Benedict came and spoke about the third secret in terms that surprised many observers, suggesting that its meaning was not exhausted by the events of the 20th century. Francis came for the centenary and canonized Francisco and Jacinta, completing a process that had taken 100 years. What would Leo XIV bring? What question would his visit ask? What response would it offer? The answer is not yet known. No official date has been set. The Vatican's calendar for 2026 is full and becoming fuller. but the direction of travel is visible to anyone who watched a pope kneel on a marble plaque and press his hand against a date carved into stone. Leo XIV is not merely interested in Fatima as a historical episode to be commemorated. He understands Fatima as a living reality, a message that was addressed to the 20th century but was not consumed by it. A message whose three secrets were not three antiquities, but three lenses through which to read the present. The vision in the third secret ends with a figure in white at the foot of a cross on a mountain. It ends with bishops and priests and lay people falling around that figure. It ends with an angel crying out for penance. The official interpretation delivered in 2000 situated this vision in the past. But the Church has also always acknowledged that prophetic images do not work like photographs. They are not one-to-one correspondences with single events. They are, in Ratzinger's own words, a synthesis of history, capable of speaking to more than one moment, capable of remaining meaningful as the centuries move. A pope who understands this, and who has, in the first year of his pontificate, consistently demonstrated that he thinks in long arcs, will not arrive at Fatima with a simple commemorative message. He will arrive with something to say about this moment, about what the message of peace means when peace is contested, about what the request to disarm means when disarmament is a political as much as a spiritual question, about what it means to pray the rosary for peace when the wars of the present carry the same nationalistic energies that haunted the Europe of 1917. Leo XIV will not say these things the way a political figure would say them. He will say them the way a man formed by Augustine says them, in the awareness that history is always more than its surface, that what appears as political struggle is always also a spiritual contest, that the question of peace is always ultimately a question about the human heart and what it chooses to worship. Disarm your hearts. That sentence, delivered to Portuguese pilgrims on a May morning in Rome, was not a greeting. It was not a pleasantry. It was a diagnosis and a prescription and an invitation, all in 3 words. And it was drawn directly from the well of Fatima, from a message that a woman clothed in light delivered to 3 children on a hillside in 1917, and that has been waiting, with a patience that does not appear to diminish, for the world to hear it properly. Pope Leo XIV has heard it. That much is clear from what he said and what he did on the 13th of May 2026. Whether the world will hear it, and what that would look like if it did, is the question that now hangs in the air, quiet and persistent, like the memory of a spinning sun over a field in Portugal. There is a detail from that day that has not received as much attention as it perhaps deserves. After Leo XIV pressed his hand against the marble plaque and rose to his feet, he remained for just a moment. Those close to him described a stillness, not the stillness of someone pausing for a photograph or marking time, a different kind of stillness, the kind that comes when a person has gone somewhere inside themselves briefly and returned. What passes through the mind of a pope standing on the exact stone where another pope was shot, on the exact anniversary of the first Fatima apparition, while carrying the knowledge that he himself has publicly said he wants to visit the shrine, while about to deliver a catechesis on the woman to whom that other pope attributed his survival? No one can say. The interior of another person is not accessible, but those who have studied Leo XIV closely, who have watched his gestures and his silences as well as his words, describe a man who carries the weight of his office not as a burden that bends him, but as a gravity that steadies him. He is not theatrical. He does not perform emotion for audiences. When he is moved, it shows in the quality of his attention rather than the expression on his face. And on May 13th, standing over that marble, his attention was total. The history of the Catholic Church is, in one reading, a history of responses to Marian apparitions. Not because the Church requires belief in any particular apparition. It does not. Private revelation, even when approved, is never binding in the way that Scripture and tradition are binding. But because these apparitions have proven again and again to carry an accuracy about the shape of history that cannot be entirely dismissed. La Salette predicted troubles in France that came. Lourdes established a site of healing that has documented thousands of cases that medical science has found difficult to explain. And Fatima. Fatima predicted a Second World War, the rise and eventual fall of Soviet communism, and an attack on the life of a pope. 3 of the most significant events of the 20th century laid out an outline before any of them occurred. The Church does not require its members to draw any particular conclusion from this, but it does not pretend it did not happen. And Leo XIV, formed in the Augustinian tradition that has always taken history seriously as the arena of God's action, does not pretend it did not happen either. His catechesis on May 13th was built on the foundation of what the Second Vatican Council actually said about Mary. Not sentimentality, not popular piety abstracted from theology, but the careful language of Lumen Gentium, which situated Mary within the life of the Church in a way that gives her appearances in history a specific kind of weight. She appears as herself, as the model, the member, the mother. Her messages are addressed to the community she mothers. Her requests are not addressed to individuals alone, but to the whole church, and through the church to the whole world. Pray the rosary every day for peace. Consecrate Russia. Do penance. These were not requests for the 1917 church alone. Lucia herself understood them as ongoing, as requests that retained their urgency until they were genuinely answered. Not symbolically acknowledged, but genuinely answered, which is a different thing entirely. Leo XIV is a man who understands the difference between symbolic acknowledgement and genuine response. His gesture at the marble plaque was not symbolic in the dismissive sense. It was symbolic in the proper sense, a sign that participates in the reality it points to. By kneeling where John Paul II had bled and prayed, Leo was not merely commemorating an event. He was entering into a continuity. He was situating his own pontificate within the line of those who have taken Fatima seriously, who have understood the message not as a historical document to be preserved and analyzed, but as a living word to be received and enacted. The question of his visit to Fatima is, in this light, not a logistical question. It is a theological one. When he goes, and the language of desire he has used suggests the question is when, not if, he will go as the inheritor of a conversation that began in 1917 and has not been concluded. He will stand on the esplanade where Paul VI stood, where John Paul II stood 3 times, where Benedict stood, where Francis stood. And he will have to say something about this moment, about where the world is now, about whether the message has been received, about what penance and prayer and disarmament of the heart mean in this particular season of human history. The third secret in the Church's understanding has been revealed. But revelation is not the same as comprehension. A text can be published and still not be heard. A message can be transmitted and still not be received. The image of a bishop in white at the foot of a cross, surrounded by the fallen, crying out for penance, that image has been in the public domain since the year 2000. It has been read and discussed and debated. But whether it has been heard, in the deeper sense that Fatima itself invites, heard as an address, a summons, a living word directed at the present, is a different question entirely. Pope Leo XIV, kneeling on a cobblestone on a May morning, seemed to be engaged with that deeper question. Not performing piety, practicing it, not commemorating a message, receiving it, and in that reception, in that quiet moment, with one hand flat against cold marble, something was set in motion, not announced, not explained, simply done in the clear May light, in a city that has seen more history than most and has not yet finished making it. Whatever Leo XIV carries forward from this moment, toward Fatima, toward a pontificate that is still in its early chapters, toward a world that is still, as the message of 1917 observed, in danger of closing itself to the gifts it most needs, he carries it as someone who has already shown that he understands the weight of the stone beneath his hand. That is where this story stands, not at its end, at the beginning of something,